Hey everybody, let's try this again. Couldn't hear anything here. So there you go. That's a great way to start your very first broadcast. Welcome to the first episode of Forensics Talks. This is a series of interviews where we're going to be inviting forensic professionals from all different disciplines. And we're going to be discussing their work, their backgrounds, technology, research, and where things are headed in each of the disciplines. This is a very informal setting, so there's nothing really scripted. As you can see, things can go wrong, and we can ask all kinds of questions, and it's also interactive. My name is Eugene Lisho, and I'm a 3D forensic analyst at AI2 3D, and I'm located in the Greater Toronto Area here in Canada. My job is to use 3D technologies to reconstruct crime scenes, and I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto in Mississauga. A couple of things before we get started with our guest. The Forensics Talk series is going to be every Thursday at 2 p.m. So make sure you mark that. And if you go to YouTube and you subscribe to the channel, it's Forensic Animations. And I can probably bring that up here so you can see it. But just make sure that you subscribe and you'll get the reminders as well. It will be recorded in case you miss it, so you can always catch up with it later on. Now, if you are on YouTube, by all means, please pop in and leave a comment. And actually, I'd be very interested to know where you're from, what city you're from, what country you're from. It's always nice to know. Always nice to know where people are. Also, I'd like to say a big thank you to the IAFSM, that's the International Association of Forensic and Security Metrology, and they help to promote this event in their organization. I'm a member, and so is our guest today. So let's talk about our guest just before I bring him on. Mark Johnson, if you've ever seen him at a conference or a presentation, he gives some really great talks. He's the CEO of Visual Law Group since 2012. He's an expert in 3D forensic visualization and animation. And Mark actually has a very interesting background, and that is that he was a plaintiff's trial lawyer. Since 1993, he's been working as a forensic animator, and he's worked on all sorts of interesting cases. And I'm hoping that we get a chance to look at some of these today and maybe ask him some questions directly about that. And also, he's been featured on 60 Minutes, Good Morning America, and even the New York Times. One thing about Mark is that he's an advocate for the use of 3D technologies in the courtroom. He's got some publications on his website, which I'll bring up later on. And, he talks about the use of multimedia and demonstrative evidence and how this is all applied in the courtroom. So with that, I'd like to welcome Mark Johnson here. Mark, I hope you can hear me and everything, and thank you very much.
A pleasure. Good to be here.
All right, great. I had a little hiccup there at the beginning, but yeah, it looks like you're coming in loud and clear. Well, look, I mentioned a little bit about your bio and your background, and the one thing that I thought was interesting is that you actually were a plaintiff's trial lawyer, so you actually have a sort of different perspective. You know what it means to stand in front of people and try to explain something to them. I'm just wondering, do you think that's given you some insight or some benefit?
Well, I think the biggest benefit is to have a good understanding of both discovery and evidentiary admissibility, because there are people certainly more talented than we are, but no matter how talented you are, if you don't understand both the basis of admissibility and the index of persuasiveness of what you're producing, it's not going to be of much value and could even be counterproductive at trial. So we like to emphasize the fact that we are consultants both with respect to persuasive science, and we are very attuned to and fastidious about elements of admissibility of the work we produce.
Okay, great. Now, one of the things I definitely want to cover on this talk and just ask you is about technology. And so, like, you've been doing this for a while, right? So, in 1993, you're getting up there. You're getting up there in the number of years in terms of experience.
Yeah.
So, I guess the first question is, and we'll get to the modern stuff and everything else, but how have things changed for you from when you first started in the 90s and then, progressing forward through the years? And on that note, has there been a pivotal point during that time?
I actually go back, at least in my timeline, back to the 80s when I was practicing, because my involvement in this first came about because one of my partners had hired a firm out of Denver to produce a 3D animation on a case, and it was all messed up. And I had a background in art and design, and I also was interested and was using video and computers and this stuff in my own practice. So they asked me to go meet with these people, and I spent a couple days in Denver, and I thought what they were doing looked like a heck of a lot more fun than what I was doing, and that actually truly motivated me and became the kind of jumping off point to when I began doing forensic visualization as a career. Then I can also say that back then, of course, things were much more primitive in terms of the tools we had, but the things that were paramount at the time were video and photographic imagery. And, those of us who are old people know very well how Mel Belli pioneered some of the early demonstrative evidence in the courtroom. And people back in the 80s and early 90s became very aware that juries were reacting to what they saw and what was presented to them. So much so that a great deal of attention was placed on video editing, the use of aerial imagery, and basically what would seem now kind of primitive, but at the time was closer to maybe a PowerPoint presentation, but that was revolutionary in the courtroom. And so when we go back to those days, and for me personally, the very first case that I did, I actually created on a Macintosh using a really obscure 3D program that was very limited. And then relatively quickly, I became conversant with the electric image animation system, which had been used in some film and television work.
Mm-hmm.
It really kind of opened my eyes. And then I had a brief period where I was doing the Amiga computer with the video toaster, which most people don't realize that was the first iteration of Lightwave 3D, the first really full-featured three-dimensional soup to nuts animation and modeling program. And then before there was 3D Max, of course, there was 3D Studio that ran under the old DOS system. And all of these sort of embryonic 3D packages rather quickly came to the fore. And the guys that produced the Mitchell Brothers animation, the famous criminal case where the brothers of a kind of a famous porn purveyors, one of them shot the other, and they produced what now looks like a very primitive animation, but that was the very first animation introduced in a courtroom in California. And that became kind of the touchstone for a long period, to the point now where we have hyperrealism and all of the things that people are familiar with now.
Okay, so the tools that you're using, I remember using a DOS version of 3D Studio, and I think it was owned by, what was the company now? I can't remember, but it was I think they were Canadian, actually. I think for a time they were in Montreal or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, nonetheless, they've definitely changed. So today, you're using 3D Studio Max, and what other tools do you use in terms of software? And I'm sure I know the answer to, if I ask you what software you're using, it's probably going to be a long list. But
yeah. But I think, like anybody in this field, you have kind of your core programs, and we happen to be split between Maya and Studio Max, and I'm a heavy Studio Max user, but my lead animator is a Maya user. So we have had to work out a lot of pipeline issues, which now work out pretty well. And FBX is as a sort of Rosetta Stone in terms of universal language. It works out okay for us, and a lot of times we go back and forth and then end up compositing between the two. But those are our primary animation tools, and I'm very aware that, and have worked with people who have done all of the other alternatives that C4D or Soft Image still out there. A lot of people are using that. But anybody that works in this field, I think you come to realize that the tools are secondary to the fundamentals of 3D, and you should be able to move between programs relatively easily as soon as you become conversant with one of the majors.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, most recently, I've actually been looking at and trying to try my hands at Blender, and so I tried Blender early on, and it was extremely frustrating because of the interface and everything else, and so I got switched off. And then most recently, I've gone back to look at it, and I'm really impressed with what they've done with the software.
I have to agree with you, and I have it on my workstation, and I have been working with it myself, and I have been amazed at the power of open source, because as those of you should probably know, it's completely free and completely supported by a joint enterprise of users. The code is available to anyone, and the result is almost every tool that I can think of in terms of rigging, in terms of rendering, in terms of many of the sophisticated, match moving, it's available in Blender. So if I were talking to some 18-year-old, I would probably say I would make Blender a real high priority, because you will clearly have accessibility at no cost to a major platform, and even the few third-party add-ons that you pay for are really reasonably priced. So there's a huge. I've seen examples that I don't believe could be matched or exceeded with any other package, and that shows you how mature it is right now. So
yeah,
that's
for sure.
Huge thing.
Let me ask you about, we're talking about software now. Let's switch for a second to hardware. I know for me, when I began, and of course, what I thought I was going to be doing when I started and what I'm doing today are slightly different, or actually quite different. But there came a point for me where I realized I need better data. And I'm wondering, when did that happen for you? And what, let's talk about maybe some of the tools that you were using and maybe what you're using today.
Well, it's interesting, because when you and I had a real brief discussion earlier, I told you I was fooling with some new stuff that I wanted to share with you, and I'll just mention it now, because what we have seen, and this is a little bit maybe different than your question, and you can steer me if you will, but today, what has become apparent to me, that the ability to have interactive exhibits is really exploding, and it's very clear to me that that's going to be a core, and it's certainly one that we want to get into. And so as a result, we are making a push now with regard to Unreal Engine, and one of the advantages of it is that Epic Games, aside from the big controversy they're having now with Apple, for somebody that is interested in working with Unreal Image, which is an extraordinarily sophisticated visualization tool, it's absolutely free, and you only pay if you have a commercial release. And at least as I read the agreements, I think if you're just doing a one-off for a courtroom presentation, I don't believe there's a commercial spiff that you have to pay. They're mainly interested in expanding the user base and the sophistication, and so that is a tool that we're working with. But the sort of adjunct to that, which became apparent to me, is they bought a French company that makes this product called Twinmotion, which is for architects, and it is to create a real-time scene that can allow architects to show off their work, and you can walk through the structure. You can instantly change lighting and accurately have sun positions. You can have weather conditions. You can have and rudimentary animation in terms of motion paths and doors. But what was interesting to me, and the reason that we embraced it, was that it's completely real time. So there's no render cycle when you're setting it up. What you see is what you get. And the level of realism with the tools that it has are extraordinary. And we have now successfully used it for a couple cases, and it's relatively new. But as a test, we recently got involved with and reached an agreement with a television station out of Salt Lake City, Utah, and they have collaborated with us. And I think it's going to be September 10th. We're going to be showing how this tool can be used as a high-end visualization tool for interactive visualization of the Vallow Daybell crime scene, which is now one of the biggest public attention crime cases going on. The woman and her husband, not only did their spouses mysteriously die, you also have a brother that died, and then you had 2 kids that disappeared and now were found buried in the backyard of the husband. And so there's a great deal of attention. It's kind of a salacious crime. It's got a lot of these interesting elements, religious extremism, just all sorts of things. But we're going to be using this. And what we did, we essentially flew a drone, created a 3D virtual or a 3D mesh of the scene that we then basically used retopology to create a clean model. And then we brought it into twin motion, where we have you can paint tens of millions of blades of grass that will actually move in the wind with a paintbrush in less than 3 seconds. And so it's a very interesting tool, and I'll share some of that with you later. But I wanted to just mention that what we see happening is tools like this, Unreal Image, certainly Unity. I know a lot of people who are building stuff in Unity, and it gives you the advantage of a sophisticated 3-dimensional visualization that can be viewed, navigated interactively. And we've been doing this for some time, where we've had interactive exhibits that the prosecutor can show to the jury. In fact, we recently did the Oakland ghost ship manslaughter trial, where 36 people unfortunately perished in a fire. And we created an interactive 3D model of the warehouse, and it was so effective that when the jury was out deliberating, they asked the judge to give them an iPad so that they could navigate the model. And yeah, and what you see here, this is a portion of the model that we have on Sketchfab, which is a real-time rendering program. And this is part of what was a larger interactive exhibit, where the prosecution could not only dissolve away the floors and they could show the location of the fire, but also the post-fire conditions and the presence of the decedents in the wreckage. So I think what you have now, 10 years from now, is going to look rudimentary, just like I say we look back on the stuff in the 90s. But what you're going to see more and more is what's closer to a virtual reality or maybe a video game experience from the jury box. And of course, what I keep waiting to happen is for the jurors to have on virtual reality helmets, an Oculus or something similar.
Have you guys been messing with that at all, or have been trying some VR?
We have, and we actually had a case that we had a judge and counsel that were amenable to it. So we were going to go forward, but the case settled. And so right now we have we've kind of got all of the steps in order, but it's so difficult to find an active lawsuit where both sides would agree to it. Almost by definition, as an attorney, you are suspicious of anything the other side is in favor of. And so if you were to go to 100 lawyers and say, hey, the opposition wants to use this VR technology, would you be okay with it? I think 100 times they would say no, just as a reflex.
Sure.
But that's going to change eventually, and I think within the next year or two we will see that happen. And I hope we get to do it. If not, I hope somebody else that's does it with a good presentation so that it can advance the ball.
Yeah, let's talk about 3D technologies, and that's actually going back to my original question, which was what kinds of things, like for example, did you start with total station or did you start with GPS, and then did you migrate, and how have they had an effect, and what are your most dominant tools? What are the most go-to tools that you have?
Yes, and I think that's a good point. And when I look back, and so I kind of go back to the 90s when I look at when we really kind of in earnest started doing this stuff, and we wrote a couple. There actually is a really fantastic attorney up in he's in Spokane now. He used to be up in Idaho, named Dave Saraceno, and he's written a lot in the legal technology field. And Dave and I worked on a couple projects, and we wrote an article for Law Office Computing that was a magazine at the time, and it was basically devoted to the concept of 3D presentation. And so back then, the tools that we had were really relatively limited, and so we were just essentially doing basically overviews to try to orient people. And at the same time that was going on, we were heavily relying upon aerial imagery. And I mention this because when you talk about things that changed dramatically our work, I think both of these areas kind of are equal. And so when I talk about aerial imagery, almost every case, whether it was a crime scene or whether it was a transportation disaster, almost every case would benefit from an aerial overview, but there was no good way to get that imagery. And so back in about 1998, a company showed up in my office, and they were marketing CD collections of aerial imagery. It was all black and white, but it was much better than anything else available on an ad hoc basis. And so we subscribed to it, and we used those a great deal. Now, as we would get a case, and a major case, we needed more resolution, we needed more information, and so we would go to, and we got to know all of the purveyors of aerial imagery. And out in California, Pacific Aerial was the biggest that we worked with constantly, and it was just a crapshoot whether anything in their library would be of a worthwhile resolution. And so then almost overnight, suddenly there was Google Earth and Google Maps. And people don't understand how extraordinarily revolutionary it was to get that level of resolution on almost a global scale, certainly on a national scale. And then following them were some of the other purveyors. There was a website Microsoft was behind called TerraServer, where there was a collection of imagery we subscribed to. And then there were some other, Microsoft came up with Bing, and they licensed an aerial imagery set that had oblique aerials, which were fabulous, and I wish we could still get those. Disappeared. But the bottom line was that as we were working on cases, we recognized one of the first and most important things to visualize it in 3 dimensions was to start with, you had to start with an accurate plan view, orthographic view. And so aerial imagery was the basis upon everything that we built, because it had to be admissible, it had to be accurate, and that was one way that we could accurately show it. Now, we did have a total station. Back then, it wasn't practical for us, except on a very few instances, to do our own work, but we worked heavily with surveyors, and we were so used to commissioning these total station diagrams, we called them, and they were just basically plan view, orthographic views that had the physical evidence and the major curb lines, and and we became used to thinking in terms of a tree being a drip line and a central trunk, completely unrealistic. Mm-hmm. But it was enough of a basis because it had been measured, and it had enough indicia of accuracy that you could get it admitted into court. So we would build off of total station diagrams, and when we had them aerial images, then all of a sudden we had Google Earth, and we then had the ability with drones to get our own high resolution imagery. And then on top of that, photogrammetric software came along, where you can now take your aerial imagery, whether you fly it or you commission someone to fly it, and you can then develop and build a 3-dimensional volume set that is the basis that you work from. So as we went through the aerial imagery side, it was kind of developing with 3 dimensions. But on the 3-dimensional side, the thing that changed everything for us was, and I remember when we got our first case, and it again was about 1998, I think, we had the first case that we needed to do motion tracking. We had and move matching, and that changed everything because we could go to a scene, we could windshield mount a camera, or we could use a hood mount. We could drive an accident scene, and then we could. Back then, we were using it was before Bojo, but anyway, it was the software.
Is it Synthesize?
RealViz. No, it was before.
RealViz.
It's called RealViz, and they made a tracking program that worked pretty well. And so we could take our model and put the vehicles and the witnesses in the digital video image. And so 3-dimensional video became more than the quote cartoon, and it was actually premised upon a video plate. And we got really sophisticated back in the early 2000s, where we were spending a lot of money to get cinematographers from Hollywood with Airflex cameras, and we were producing these really high-end productions that we would then move match the 3-dimensional elements into, and we became specialized in nighttime stuff, because the real problem back then was the lack of realistic response or low light capability in digital video. Mm-hmm. And so everything had to be shot on film. So we would shoot on film, we would have the film processed and developed at this Hollywood facility, and we'd end up with, usually we were shooting 35 millimeter shots, either from a locomotive if it was a train case, or a highway, we'd use cars. And so that became very, very sophisticated in terms of the quality of the imagery. And then it kind of went back as more fidelity became achievable. We ended up going back to all 3 dimensions. We still do a fair amount of move matching, but it's become more practical and functional for us to build the whole scene in 3D, and then we can do our own camera angles as opposed to being locked in to what we shot at the time.
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you mentioned drones, right? And so I was just some statistics here that I was checking up on and just kind of throwing out. So from the FAA website, 1.6 million registered drones in the U.S., 487,000 of those or more than are commercial, and there's about 1.2 million that are recreational, and 190,000 more than people are remote pilot certified. They talk about the annual growth rate in the U.S. is about 6.4%. Also, DJI owns about 80% of the drone market, which I thought was kind of interesting. And there's on a website called CompTIA.org, they talk about the global market reaching something crazy like 43 billion by 2024. So drones have had obviously a huge impact, and obviously it's probably going to continue there. So I mean, you also educate on drones as well, right? Like you train people as well?
Yes, my wife, who is also creative director for the company, is both a full-scale civil aviation pilot and a certified drone operator, and she is an instructor, and so she teaches drone classes both to photographers and to those interested on the forensic side. And so we have done a great deal of training, but I focus mainly on acquisition for our projects. I was just my first trip since COVID. Yesterday I was on a plane and I was out in Livermore, California on a case, and I've acquired about 1,200 images of a motorcycle SUV collision, and processed it last night. And I used a laser scanner for some of the critical evidence, but I've got about 2,000 feet of highway and the surrounding hills, none of which I would have been able to accurately collect with my laser scanner in the time that I had allotted, and in basically
Mhm.
3 hours at the scene, we've got everything documented and collected in 3 dimensions now. So
Let's talk about one of the cases. There was one Kings Canyon. I'll bring it up here.
yeah,
This is
that's a
on,
great case.
yeah, this is on Sketchfab. So can you tell me about this particular case?
Yeah, and what you're looking at there is the raw mesh uh, that was collected from drone imagery. It was an interesting case because it's on Federal National Park, and it was rather, if you are aware, you can't fly there, but we were fortunate because our client was the state of California, who then worked with the federal government and the dispatcher who actually manages the airspace of the park, and got permission. And I was able to have Romeo Dersher, who is the vice president for search and rescue and public safety for DJI, and he came out and brought some of their new toys, and we flew this area. And so what we have here now, it's on Sketchfab, which I highly recommend. It's a great way to get a navigable 3D image. And like if you click on that number 1, Eugene, with your little cursor there, you'll see a little annotation. So Sketchfab lets you annotate things. This happens to be a scene after we flew it, we processed it, and we wanted to talk about some of the areas that were significant in the accident reconstruction. And so the point of rest of the vehicle in question is right there. And then just by interesting, number 3 is wreckage of another car. And the fascinating part of this was that this car had nothing to do with our case. And as a matter of fact, that car wasn't even known. But when the news crew was out at the scene where our car left the road, and they were shooting footage, one of the off-duty policemen from San Diego was watching the broadcast, and he saw a license plate that actually was a San Diego license plate, and this couple had been missing, and he recognized it as their car. And so he put 2 and 2 together, and turns out another car had left the road with nobody observing it, and they didn't even, people weren't even aware they were up there at the park, but their car was found there. And so that became an interesting element in our case, because we were able to locate the wreckage, and so I put an annotation there so that when the experts can talk about it, it has nothing to do with the same facts that led to our collision, but it was coincidentally at the same area and is a hairpin turn, and so it was a matter of interest, even though probably not of relevance to it.
And that was completely drone. There's no laser scanner in there or whatever.
No, we did take laser scans, and we did scan that area where the car left the scene. But what you're looking at is strictly the drone footage. At a later point, we will add the laser scanning for the increased fidelity and resolution at that point, which is the critical point where the guardrail was breached and where the car went off. But what you're looking at is the raw, non-edited, not cleaned up, strictly the mesh. And I can't avoid saying that was processed with the tool that we are huge, and that's Pix4D, which in my opinion, and I think it's by far the best tool for a forensic animator. There are other great tools, and I know some of the great people. Drone Deploy makes a great tool. There are a lot of great photogrammetric tools. PhotoScan by AGFA is extraordinary, used all over the place. But at least for what I find useful in terms of metrology, Pix4D, in my opinion, is the premier application for photo.
Yeah, there's well, I would say the trinity there that most people know about is the well, now it used to be PhotoScan. It's now called Metashape from Agisoft.
That's
and
right.
Then there's also a 3DF Zephyr, which is up and coming from a company called 3D Flow. But Pix4D has done a lot for drones, for UAVs, and I think that's what gives them a lot of strength. That the applications, the dedication to drones, they focused a lot on that, and that really it really shines through in their product.
Well, a lot of people don't realize that they are actually a subsidiary of Parrot, the drone
Oh,
maker.
I didn't
And
know that.
yeah, so they have a lot of access to tools, even though they are fly spec compared to the footprint DJI has. They do a lot of stuff in the market, and so that is an advantage that they have.
Oh, interesting. Hey, let's talk about another case here that we have, and I'm going to bring this one up as well. So this one was a medical case, maybe a malpractice case. What can you tell me
Right.
about this one?
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting case because kind of the theme we're talking about is 3D visualization. And so this was an interesting case. It turns out that relatively common, more so than I realized, there are malformations in the vessels within your brain, and where the vein and arterial capillaries, from third grade science, you know that your heart pumps blood out and it goes through the capillaries and returns through the veins. And that point where blood transitions from the artery to the venous system is the point where oxygen is interchanged, and it's the capillaries. Well, turns out that a relatively significant number of people have this malformation where essentially instead of the orderly progression of the capillaries, it's even referred to as a rat's nest, because when you look at it, it looks like a nest of interconnected, balled up vessels, and it can be subject to rupture. It can cause problems, and so in this particular instance, the woman had an arterial venous malformation in the head, and I think number 2, if you click on that, I think that's where the original, yeah, so that's where the malformation was, and so to treat this, they use a microcatheter, a very, very tiny, almost thread-like, even it's extraordinarily small, and they thread it. They start in your usually in large vessel, either your groin or your carotid artery, and they feed the capillary up in through the vessels, and they're watching on a scope all this while as they're threading it up to the point where this malformation is. And the treatment, they actually inject what is chemically the same substance that we know as superglue. And the superglue, as soon as it's injected and as soon as it hits the circulation, it solidifies. And so the way they treat this is they put the tip of the catheter up in the malformation, they inject the superglue, and it walls off the whole area. And all of that malformation then becomes static and filled, so there's no danger of embolisms or rupture. And it's a very safe treatment, and very rather straightforward. Well, in this case, the problem, and it is a known problem, because these vessels, these catheters are so small, they do have a tendency where they can rupture. And in this particular instance, the physician was not terribly experienced with the procedure, and he's got a syringe that he's pushing the plunger to inject the glue, and nothing's coming out. And so the proper response is you stop pushing and see what's going on. But instead, he, probably like somebody like me who gets a little impatient, he just kept pushing it. And what had happened was the catheter had burst near the base of the skull, and this super glue was infiltrating the vasculature of the brain. And as you can imagine, all hell broke loose. There were just massive series of strokes, infarctions. So one of the critical elements of the case was how much glue actually ended up in the skull, and because it is a known consequence that you can have this rupture. And when you looked at the medical records, they recorded it was just a very tiny amount, and so the defense was this was just a natural mishap. Well, so what we did to try to accurately determine how much glue was in the brain and also show where it was, we took a series of radiology CAT scans and we developed a filter where we got the opacity of the glue. And so we took slice after slice after slice after slice, and we stacked all of these slices up, and then we extracted the opaque, or the glue opacity, and then converted it into a three-dimensional volume, which is what you see. So the exterior of the skull here, that's the three-dimensional volume from the radiology, which, if those of you worked in medical cases, it's becoming more common, where you can extract three-dimensional models of bony structures relatively easy. But what was not extractable until we did our process was the glue. And as you can see, it's just wildly dispersed. And so this was a way to not only show where the glue was, where the infarctions were, but also it put the lie to the defense, which was this was a very minute amount. And as you can see, we measured it, and it was almost half of the volume of the syringe. And that doesn't count any amounts that had dissipated or were out of the system at that point. So I think it was extremely effective. And anybody that looks at that, your immediate reaction is, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It shows you just the catastrophe that occurred, and it became much more easy and persuasive to see why this was a mishap that could have been avoided. There was just no reason that, by the time you push the syringe, and if nothing's coming out the tip, it's got to be going somewhere.
Yeah, no, for sure. What I'm going to do is, for those of you who are interested in seeing more, if you go to Mark's website here, it's visuallaw.com. I posted it before. He's got some examples on here on different pages. Actually, there's the Ghost Ship. There's some animation here, and I believe in the gallery and recent cases, there's some other stuff that you can see here, which I think might be interesting for people to have a look at when they get a chance. So something else I want to ask you about, Mark, is your team. And I know one person on your team, which is Abby Lyle, and she's a photographer. She's an actual, or I don't know if she still maintains her pilot's license, but she used to fly airplanes, right?
She flies Cessnas and then drones.
Drones, and she's also she's an instructor, right? She teaches, right, and that sort of thing. I'm wondering about the kind of people that are on your team, the backgrounds, and that sort of thing. And the other thing that sort of tie into that is there may be students that are watching this thing. And one of the things we talked about the other day was the fact that sometimes students coming out of university or whatever, they don't even realize that this is a discipline, or that it's an area that they can even get into. So what kinds of things do you look for in the people you bring on your team, or what kinds of things might be important to get involved into, or that might be required, or might be important to have as a background to get into this area?
And that's an excellent question. And I can tell you that I've had the good fortune of, on a number of instances, I have been asked by peers in our profession to suggest or help them headhunt people. For instance, probably about 10 or 15 years ago, the great, and I consider one of the flagship companies in this field, is High Impact out of the Denver area. And I've known those guys a long time and done some work for them, and they wanted to add a director of animation. And so I helped them headhunt a young man who became their director and was very, very successful. And since that time, I've been able to do that, to either find staff animators or to suggest people for interviews. And I've even, as recently as a couple months ago, one of the baristas at my Starbucks had heard what we did and said that she was completing a undergraduate degree in forensic science, and she wanted some suggestions. And so there's a couple things that I would suggest and feel are very important. The two things that in our field, and recognize that we are unique in terms of we're a little boutique shop, we're relatively small, and what we do is obviously characterized by who we are, and probably would not be a valid model for many of the other shops out there. But having given you that caveat, the two things that we look at that are critical are um, 3D visualization experience, and not necessarily study or academic work. We're talking about the portfolio, and right now the critical thing for us is at least some understanding of interactivity. Scripting or programming would be very, very, very useful, but not necessarily required. But at least an understanding with the ability to create an interactive presentation, that would be critical. And that's the reason that all of us now are spending time with tutorials with Unreal Image, because we've chosen that as going to be our platform for interactivity. We have used a number of other things. We love the SimLab Composer product and its ability to produce 3D PDF files, but it's not a level of interactivity that we feel that we need. And so that's why I'm saying that not only we, but I know other shops are going to be very interested. Anybody who is either a modeler or an animator, but has a facility and ability to work with either Unreal or with Unity, because those are going to be the two almost certainly presentation platforms that are going to be used for evidence. The other thing that we focus on for us is an understanding of legal processes. We recently did add an accident reconstructionist engineer to our team, and we chose him because he is a drone pilot. He's worked with Autodesk products. He uses Recap, which Recap Photo is a kind of a competitor of Pix4D, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
He also has the engineering degree and is able to calculate and determine velocities. And so he was a natural, and that would be anybody that has an engineering degree but understands 3D would be very valuable. And then the other thing, which would be extremely valuable, would be somebody that has some sort of a legal background, whether that's a paralegal, a lawyer like me, or somebody who's worked with one of the jury consulting firms would be a good candidate. Because so many of our clients, and let's make no bones about it, we work both criminal and civil, but on the criminal side, it's absolutely 100% focused on either convicting on the side of the prosecution or defending the defendant on the defense side, and that's the end all be all of the case. So the extent to which you can serve that goal is extremely important. And then on the civil side, it's of course the same thing: the verdict on behalf of the plaintiff to achieve compensation for the decedent's family or the injured party, or to defend the same. And so for us, we look at people that have experience, and let's get real basic as well. And I've seen this in a number of shops beside our own. Somebody that has the ability to interact with and talk with and sell this technology is extremely valuable. And so I've known a number of people and have worked with a number of people who their primary function is to go to the law firm or to work with the expert as a liaison and to project manage the project. So if I was talking to the barista who was finishing up her degree, she's probably more a candidate for one of the agencies or public laboratories because of her background. And so when you talk about classic forensics, and I know you have more experience with that yourself, Eugene, because of your background and the cases you've handled. But when you look at us, we're kind of almost 100% pure 3D focused. We're not as empirical based as you are with some of the things that you've developed. And so you could probably speak, and probably should speak more to that side of the profession. But for us, engineers, law, and then 3D mavens, and so I wouldn't hesitate, and I probably would on my first, if I had to go higher, I'd probably go to the video game industry first, special effects second, and then I'd go into some of the more esoteric groups where people have developed maybe 3D apps for some of the phones and pad hardware. So
Well, yeah, you raise a good point, which is you have to marry up, the visual aspect, which is the 3D, the people that are modeling, that are animating, and then you have to try and marry it up with the science side, the physical side, and try to get you the best product, which is deep in on both sides, right? It's a rabbit's hole on either way. So you can really get deep. So often, I know for myself, it's sometimes we have a small team here. Actually, we got called out, so I'm completely by myself today, except for the little guy I got over there. So I call him Malcolm. He's over there, so he's helping me out. He's our big dummy. But yeah, when you have to do everything yourself, it's pretty tough. So sometimes relying on other people and having a team is helpful. And just as we're doing now, I know that you and I have discussed, topics before, asked for help, leaning on other people in the industry. That's a huge deal. And I think that's one of the reasons why, we go to conferences and why we do this kind of thing. So I have a last question for you. Mm-hmm. And that has to do with the future and you've been in here for the long haul and you've seen all these things change over the years. And I consider you somebody who has, you're driven, you try to use new technology, you're always looking for a better solution. What kind of things do you want to achieve, or what kind of things do you think, are we can look forward to in the next, several years, or that sort of thing? What are you driving for?
The answer to that question would have been a little bit different, 9 months ago. And I used to tell people that we had a recession-proof business, and that as soon as the economy turns bad, if anything, people start suing each other more. And so I was kind of smug, but when the COVID pandemic struck, it shut down the court system. It shut down our clients. I mean, we saw a massive change in the way we did business. And what we've now seen, it's kind of opened my eyes, and frankly, it opened the eyes of a lot of people, that the concept of remote viewing, remote participation, just like this interview, just like Zoom conferences, that is going to be huge. And I've participated now in some cases where my appearance at trial was through Zoom. I've seen a case where the jury participated through Zoom. The Daybell Vallow case I mentioned, all the preliminary hearings and the arraignments have been done through Zoom with participants remotely. And there's some talk about not only is this experience of a pandemic being possible again or lingering, but beyond that, it's forced people to see the consequences and advantages of remote learning, remote presentation, and it allows us to do things. So if I look at the future, I would say I would put a heavy premium on the kind of technologies. For instance, this application that you're using today it's StreamYard. I didn't even know it existed until you sent me the link. And as best I can tell, you are running this and doing everything from camera switching to screen sharing, and it appears you're doing it seamlessly, and either you're smarter than I thought you were, or else it's a very functional application. But this is the kind of thing now that I think is going to characterize a lot of what we in the forensics field are used to. And we're going to start seeing remote examinations of crime scenes. We're going to see remote presentations for court. Depositions, have over time moved And I've done several depositions, video depositions remotely through video conference. So to what I see, I think the development of broadband technologies with presentation tools is going to markedly change what we do and how we do it. And I'll be honest with you, if I could do all of my work without leaving this desk, I'd be very, very happy.
Yeah. That's true. Well, on that note, I think it was a couple of years ago. I had to do a trial while I was in Europe for a case that was in Oregon, and one of the challenges was for the court just to get me on a conference call. So never mind Skype, like they wouldn't use the regular tools. They had their own system, and I can tell you the hoops that we had to jump through to get this thing to work. And the problem was, the work that we do is very visual, and so you want to be able to show stuff. Well, this was a phone testimony only, and so it was horrible for me. It was the worst thing, because you couldn't talk about what it is. And I mean, there's something to be said about being there as well, so that you can see faces of the people and the jury and the lawyers and the judge and that sort of thing too. But I think you make that's a really, really good point, that even exploring new technologies to communicate this stuff at trial and for the jury.
In that regard, if I can, I'd also like to mention that I'm seeing a lot of sort of hybrid or kind of ancillary technologies and businesses that are developing. And as an example, I have a couple friends who are in LA, and they used to be NBC producers, and they would write and produce Dateline and some other news stories. And, that was their bread and butter. That's what they did. And they realized that juries were becoming more and more sophisticated. So they created a company called Juris Productions, where their whole reason to exist is to produce high-end documentaries for a particular case. And that documentary is used at a mediation or a settlement conference. And there's no secret that more than 90% of all cases that are filed disappear because they are resolved before ever going to trial. And they recognize that the ability to succeed at the level of mediation or settlement probably was much more valuable than being the greatest trial lawyer in the world, because that's where most of the dollars are resolved. And the better that they can do for those clients, the better the outcome is for that side and for the system. And so you are now starting to see companies that are either video based, or in the case of Juris Productions, they are an ancillary service for the litigation. And so they hire us occasionally to produce forensic elements that they use in their videos. And I can see that if I was a younger person and trying to develop and carve out a niche for myself, I would view forensics, 3D forensic, what we're talking about today, I would view that as a component of a larger ecosystem, and I'd try to figure out how to serve that ecosystem. And that means all sorts of things like training. We mentioned Abby trains drone operators, both law enforcement, attorneys, paralegals, photographers. That's a whole area that exists in and of itself, and we're just a small part of it. And so the same thing with you, with some of the things I know that you're involved with your academic profession and some of the research stuff you do. So I would say the biggest lesson I would try to take from this is that the technology is driving much of what's going on, and it's not going to stay within a box. It's going to, its tentacles will reach out. And, like the drone technology is now ubiquitous: search and rescue, surveying, event production. And so the more that you can harness these technologies, the more dangerous and valuable you are as a person. And that's the message that I would give to any student or any prospective employee that would wanted to get into the business.
Excellent. Mark, I can't say enough. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. And I think for me, it was a very easy first interview for sure. You've been doing great work. Folks, if you're watching this, visit visuallaw.com, have a look at some of their samples. Mark is an easy person to reach out to. He's an excellent speaker, and he's very, very knowledgeable. Again, Mark, all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugene, very much.
All right, take care. Folks, just a couple of last things on my part. And that is, I'm just going to share my screen here so you can see it. I'm going to announce here that next week we're going to be having Matt Nodell from Nodell Scientific. Matt is very well known in the shooting reconstruction community. He is a ballistics, firearms, shooting reconstruction expert, and we're going to be talking about shooting reconstruction technology, his work, and that sort of thing. So if you can chime in, that's Thursday, September 3rd at 2 p.m. Also, the other thing that I'd like to announce is that we are going to be having a shooting documentation or shooting reconstruction week. And so what we're going to be doing is on September 14th to 18th, we're going to be releasing some tutorial videos that week that you can just register for on my website here, and I'll put up the link. So ai2-3d.com, register and sign up, and you'll get access to some videos for that week. And there will also be a free webinar, and that will be on September 21st. And so stay tuned for that if you're interested. And that concludes our first episode. I want to say thank you for everyone. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already to get notifications, and we'll see you next week. Take care.